All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I am your host, Franco, and I'm joined again by my friend Derrick Broze of The Last American Vagabond and The Conscious Resistance. He's coming with us with an important investigation on the Mormon leaders Gordan B. Hinckley and Walton Hunter. So there was recently a video that resurfaced that Broze dug into. It was a documentary VHS from the late 1980s or 1990s. And we're going to dive into what those accusations pretty much were. But Derrick, man, it's great to have you back on. How are you? Hope you're doing
I'm doing
well.
good. I'm doing good, brother. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for continuing to do your work.
Thank you, man. Yeah. So, what led you to this investigation?
Yeah. So back in early June, somebody sent me this press release from the Utah County Sheriff's Office, and the sheriff Mike Smith announced that he was investigating, in his words, ritualized child sex abuse involving three different Utah counties. And he said that the investigation involved local, state, and federal authorities. And it was literally just one or two sentences, maybe two or three sentences, and it said those things. And then it said, if you have any information about this, please reach out to us and share this info. So obviously that kind of caught my attention. I was like, whoa, ritualized child sexual abuse.
Yeah.
Some people hear that and kind of were immediately reading into it what they would call satanic. But I started to reach out to the police department and to their public information officer and got them to clarify, like, what do you mean by this? And essentially that began a series of 5 articles that I produced for The Last American Vagabond over June and July. And that looked at the sheriff's investigation, trying to understand what was taking place, because that whole thing is a whole, it's a very interesting story. It's actually an ongoing investigation still. So I was looking at that case, but then I started to also investigate claims of ritual abuse and child sexual abuse in Utah in general. So I did an article that looked at claims throughout the last 67 years, and then the final part I did, the 5th part, was about claims involving the Mormon Church, and this was pretty new to me. I've been to Utah a couple of times, but I don't know much about Utah. And for folks who maybe never looked into Utah history, most of that state is part of the LDS, the Church of Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ, or the Mormon Church, and that means politicians, most of the cops, most of authorities, their people are very much part of that church. So that's kind of a whole different element. But also there's names that you see that are pretty common, because in the early Wild West days in the United States, a lot of families and religious families, Mormons, came to found Utah. So many of those families are still in power and still very influential. So I didn't know much about any of that stuff until I started to dig into it. And when I published that 5th story, which looked at the history of abuse in the Mormon Church, the things that we know, the things that have come to light, I started to get emails from different people who were saying, hey, I grew up in the church and I left because of this thing or that thing, or, I lived in Utah and I saw this. And eventually one of those sources was the source that had the tape that you were referencing, which is called The True Story of Mormon President Gordan B. Hinckley. And so I was contacted by the source that said, hey, I have this tape. I don't think it's been seen by the public in at least 30 years. Would you be interested in this? And that kind of began what ended up being this 3-part investigation that I called Justice Delayed.
Yeah, and just to put this out there, because you've also been saying this on other shows that you've gone on when you've been interviewed about this investigation. Your investigation is not a criticism on any religion at all, right?
Yeah,
It's not
no,
a
this
criticism on Mormons at all. It's just to expose something criminal that's most likely going on, right?
exactly. Well, and so yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is a point that I feel the need to make, because unfortunately some people might take it that way, especially when you're talking about people's religious beliefs. People are very very touchy about that. But the reports, as I was saying a moment ago, it didn't initially start out
Yeah.
even talking about the Mormons. It was about this Utah investigation. But the facts are that there is a history of abuse within the Mormon Church, and I documented those in my previous articles. But the information that I've reported on in Justice Delayed, this information appears to have been suppressed, right? So that's why I reported on it, not necessarily because I enjoy writing or reading or reporting on child trafficking, as I've done in the past with Epstein and the Finders and other stories, but because this is a reality that does take place. And I would say to anyone who might have the tendency or the need to interpret this as an attack on their particular belief system. My thought is this, is that if you believe your belief system, Christianity, Catholic, Baptist, Mormon, whatever, is not, that this isn't a core part of the religious system, but it's just a few bad apples. If you believe that, then I think we should all strive to let the truth come to the surface, right? Because you're not going to get rid of those few bad apples, if that's the case, by ignoring the conversation.
Right. Yeah, because it has to be pointed out these leaders are not practicing what they preach, right? And
Exactly.
if you are a faithful believer of your religion, then that definitely needs to be pointed out. And like you mentioned, this goes beyond just the Mormon Church. There's it's a pattern we see throughout a lot of religious groups and cults where the leaders have abused sexually and through other ways have abused members of their church or of their group or of their cult, right? And Derrick Broze has done work on exposing a lot of these stories that get suppressed, such as the Finders and Epstein, which he mentioned, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I'll get into what the investigation turned out to be. So, as I said, I got this tape. It was eventually sent to me and Ryan, The Last American Vagabond. We got it digitized, and our first goal with this, just journalistically, was like, okay, we need to protect this piece of information because we hadn't even watched it yet. It could be valuable, it could be useful. We don't want it to fall in the wrong hands. We don't want it to get destroyed. Because the other thing that I've learned as I've started to research some of the history of the Mormon Church, a lot of attention has been paid to the fact that Bill Gates is one of the number one landholders in the U.S., but not so many people know that the Mormon Church is as well. I mean, if you really look at the property records, there's some good investigations that have been done in the last few years looking at the Mormon Church. Like most major religions, they tend to essentially become corporations. They have, in some cases, some of them have their own private intelligence firms that go out and do maybe counter research on people that they think are critical of the church, or try to defend against lawsuits. And the Mormon Church is no different. So it's a very big corporate apparatus that has a lot of moving parts and pieces. They own a lot of land. They're very well connected over the last couple hundred years. But what was interesting is that most of this growth has only taken place in the last 50 years, that even as far as the 70s and 80s, Mormonism was still viewed as a cult, whereas now it's seen as one of the top 3 religions in the U.S. and maybe even in the world. And that's really been a recent phenomenon. And it actually took place under the leadership of Mormon President Gordan B. Hinckley, who was in the church throughout most of his life. And he was the president till 2008 when he died. And he really modernized the church. He started buying TV stations and radio stations. He was very savvy with media. And there's a corporation called the Bonneville Media Corporation or something like Bonneville International Corporation that actually produces shows for Amazon and others. People might not realize these are Mormon funded productions. Not saying again that means it's not a good show or anything like that, but clearly they might have some goals in trying to influence the public's thinking around their traditions and their beliefs. So very powerful religion. And the tape had the name The True Story of Gordan B. Hinckley. I didn't know anything about him. I started researching him, and once we received the tape, we watched it. It's a 27-minute mini documentary that was put together in the late 80s. And I think it started circulating in the early 90s to various churches that were open to hearing it. It was, obviously before the internet. So this was just word of mouth, people sharing tapes, copying it at home and passing it around. And the tape has 5 different witnesses who claim that they were witnesses and party to these sex parties that Gordan B. Hinckley, again, the Mormon president. And it's also important to know that in the Church of Mormon, it's not just that you're the president of the church, kind of like a pastor or priest. Like, you're seen as a prophet. They are seen as pretty close to God. They're not God, they're not Jesus or anything like that, but they're not the average person. They are almost in a way worshipped and looked as sort of, unable to make mistakes. And so many people, of course, will have none of this. They think that the idea that Gordan B. Hinckley was involved in anything is just preposterous. He's, of course, a married Mormon man. He's supposed to they have certain traditions, very conservative. So the idea that Gordan B. Hinckley was being accused of attending these sex parties in the 80s, in the 60s and 70s, maybe to the end of his life, we don't know, but accused of these sex parties was something that was rejected by a lot of people when it first started coming out. And the lawyers of Gordan B. Hinckley, I found out through my research than what I put in the investigation. They actually tried to suppress these tapes. A few thousand copies of them were made in the late 80s. And I think eventually they probably either, were lost or disappeared. But when I viewed the tape and I started watching it, I looked for copies of it online. I couldn't find it anywhere online. In fact, until we recently published it on all the different platforms, it wasn't on BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin, any torrent sites, any download sites. I couldn't find any copy or really even any reference to it, except for maybe a blog or two, mainly in the kind of Mormon internet universe, like the ex-Mormon blogs and stuff, referenced it by name, but no physical or digital copies of it until just recently. And so the tape accuses Gordan B. Hinckley of being involved in sex parties involving prostitutes, homosexual relationships. Again, those things alone may be illegal, the prostitution thing in some places. Being gay is not illegal, but obviously for a man in his position, it was something that was frowned upon, especially back in this time. But the worst accusation is that there were teenage boys, they said 14, 15-year-olds, that were present at these parties. And Gordan B. Hinckley, one of the witnesses, said at least on one occasion, she saw him go into a bedroom with two young boys and, stay in there for a little while. And so obviously there's some accusations around this. And it appears that the Mormon church and their lawyers were able to successfully squash the story. And so once I received it, I started to investigate it. I started to look up the names of everybody who spoke on the tape and to see if they were still alive. The vast majority of them are dead now, unfortunately. But I was able to make a few confirmations and find out that, I basically had further corroboration of the story.
So this was bad. Like, this was stuff going on when, like, in the 60s and 70s. Like, if the tape was in the 80s or
the
late
tape was
80s,
in the
90s.
80s, and they described 1964, 1965. Whenever, at least this specific incident. Now, there may have been other incidents, but as far as what's on the tape, the accusations are in the mid 60s.
And Gordan B. Hinckley was he's dead now, right? He was born in the 1920s and he passed away when
2008. And so at the time of the specific accusations, it was before he was president. It was when he was known as what's an apostle, which is, a couple positions lower than where he would end up being. So even before he was as president, people were accusing this of him. And I did have sources say, people who have experience within the church tell me that Gordan B. Hinckley actually was reputed to have been have racked up the most lawyer fees for the church having to cover up some of his misdeeds. Like, essentially the idea is that the church has a certain allocation of funds to deal with, issues like this. And that apparently Gordan B. Hinckley cost the church quite a bit of money in that regard, having to cover up whatever he was up to. And, one of the reasons I chose to write about this, because, the timeline, 60s, right? 80s, the video, here we are in 2020, the guy's dead, most of the accused are dead. Some people might say, who cares, right? Like, what does this matter? I'll say for me, the reason it matters is because the victims, the victims that I was able to speak to that are still living, I'll talk more about them because, it's Gordan B. Hinckley, but there was also another bishop that was involved as well that I think is important to mention. But the victims, their stories do need to be heard, right? And I don't think that this should just be buried by the church. And so that's why I think it's important. But also that this stuff is still being reported on. While I was investigating this story, the Associated Press, they actually put out their own report showing that the Mormon church was covering up abuse of some children in the church by their father for at least 7 years, that the Mormon church has this helpline that if you were to call and say, hey, I witnessed some abuse by my apostle or whatever, they would tell you to call the helpline. Well, the helpline is staffed by a bunch of lawyers for the church, which specifically are there to try to filter out and catch those kinds of things so they don't become public. And so they reported on this one incident where this man admitted that he had a pedophilia problem. Like, I guess he was self-aware, and he's like, I have a problem. He was abusing his own daughter. And it went on for 7 more years because the church refused to act until it was eventually found out by the cops in New Zealand, where some other guy got caught with child porn, and he happened to have a video of this guy abusing his own daughter. I guess he was recording it on tape. So Interpol found out about it, and then they ended up arresting the man. He ended up being a Border Patrol agent in Arizona who also happened to be part of the Mormon church. And so this abuse went on for 7 years because the church did nothing when they knew about it. So I mean, the reason I say that is that this isn't just the 60s. Like if these things happened back then and they were covered up now, and now we're getting reporting that this is still happening, clearly there's a problem here.
Yeah, yeah, and it's also a reality that has to be acknowledged so that history doesn't repeat itself. That's why we learn history. That's why we learn about corruption among people throughout history, is so that things like this do not happen again, right?
Exactly. And so, I mean, that's why this story was important to me. And I'll say a little bit more about Gordan B. Hinckley, and then I'd like to talk about Walton Hunter, the other component, because that is part of the story where we actually do have some of the victims alive, and again, their voices matter. But so what we've discussed so far is I received the tape from the late 80s, early 90s that hadn't been circulated on the internet before, making accusations about Gordan B. Hinckley, and most of the people involved, nearly everybody that I found, the people who produced this, the people who were on the statements, they're all deceased. But what I also was sent by this source was the sort of last will and testimony of a man named Derrick Clegg. And so this investigation against Gordan B. Hinckley, the church president and apostle, was led by a man named Bill Clodden. Bill Clodden's now deceased, but Bill Clodden was a Mormon as well, but he was, he didn't trust Gordan B. Hinckley. And so he started this investigation, which eventually led to the documentary, the tape that we circulated. Well, Bill Clodden's friend was a man named Derrick Clegg, and Derrick Clegg came with him when he met Gordan B. Hinckley's attorney. He came with him to meet some of the different witnesses. He was a part of the investigation. And so Derrick Clegg in 2014, he recorded this interview, which was sent to me, and we released some of the answers that he shared, some of the information he shared, essentially just kind of confirming that, yes, this is accurate. This is true. I was there. This is what I witnessed. And he filled in some more of the blanks. So Derrick Clegg died in 2017, and whoever recorded this interview, he told them that he didn't want the interview to be released until after he passed away. So he died in 2017, and it took about 5 years, I guess, before somebody was able to get it out, or they sent it to me. I don't know if they've tried to send it to other people or not. But so that part of the puzzle is another witness now. So no, we have 5 witnesses on the tape saying, hey, I was at the sex parties. I witnessed the sex parties. They had sworn affidavits. And then we have Derrick Clegg, another man who was a part of the investigation, giving his testimony saying, yes, this is what I saw. I was there when the attorneys came to tell us to shut down the tape, when they told us to change our stories. They apparently even offered them money to get Bill Clodden to recant and say, okay, I made it up. It was all lies. And Derrick Clegg said that Bill Clodden told the lawyer of Gordan B. Hinckley, there's not enough money in the world for you to make me change my mind. We're not going to change what we say. But they appear to, again, either through just maybe buying copies of the tape, or just over time it was forgotten, essentially have, kept the story out of most people's awareness. So I felt it was important to talk about it, because now Derrick Clegg, he wished that this would come out. And for whatever reason, some people have told me, I wish this guy would have spoken sooner. Why did he wait till after he died? Even one of my other sources was a little bit upset. Like, why did this guy wait? I'm not here to judge that. All I know is that he shared, what he knew. And he asked that it be, wait till he passed away. And that wish was honored. And so I felt like doing this story was also a way to kind of honor his intention to have some good come of it, because he was worried till the day he died. Like in the recording, I didn't release this clip, but there's a couple times where he says, like, they could be following me. He was clearly still paranoid about, like, the Mormon church kind of harassing him, even in his old age, if he, was to bring this topic up. So he didn't want it to be talked about, or for his story to be shared till after he passed away.
Yeah, my guess is he probably wanted to have his last years in peace and not be harassed by the heads of the Mormon church, things like that. That would be my assumption. But I appreciate how you respected his wishes, and same with other people, respecting his wishes of wanting for nothing to come out until after he passed away. Now, with you've done work on the finders, and I've also had Elizabeth Voss on the show to talk about the finders. And in the case of the finders, there's evidence of police reports that were filed, I believe, right? And there is evidence of intelligence also playing a role. Yeah. Now, in this case, is there evidence of police reports attempted to be filed or anything like that?
Well, I don't. Question. I think that what Bill Claudin attempted to do is he got sworn affidavits from all the folks, and he also told Gordon B. Hinckley's attorney, he actually said to him, as reported by Daryl Clegg, please sue me so we can go to court so I can bring the witnesses I have. So, he was kind of actively encouraging them, like, hey, they thought it was a threat, like, we'll sue you to stop this. He said, please, let's file a lawsuit, let's go to court. I don't think that ever happened. And at this point, I would guess that for one, like I said, most of the people who've made these accusations are dead. I haven't been able to find any of the young boys that they may still be alive if they're out there that were involved in this. I mean, that's also another reason that I wanted to talk about this, is that by doing the story, that hopefully anybody else who does have more information might hear it and come forward. And in fact, I can say there will be more to this story in coming months, because I'm already starting to get more information from more sources who have seen and witnessed things. And so there wasn't anything legally pursued, I think, because of statute of limitations. But one other point I want to add on this is that also there were people who told me that at least one of the prostitutes that was involved was found dead in circumstances that was told to me that they were suspicious and that were suspected of some foul play. I have not been able to. There's a couple of these women who were apparently prostitutes. I don't know 100%, so I'm going to say apparently. At least a couple of them are still living, and we're trying to locate them. But again, most people who were involved at this time or witnessed things, if they're still alive, they're probably, as you were saying a moment ago, just trying to live out their days and not, and maybe avoiding being found. And that's kind of the difficulty. Is I spent weeks before we published this at all. I spent weeks trying to track down everybody I could, trying to verify, contacting people, calling people, emailing. I even gave the Mormon Church a heads up we were going to publish to see if they wanted to comment. I sent these stories and my investigation to every media outlet in Salt Lake City, and so far the church and the media outlets have chosen to ignore the story.
I'm not even wanting to dismiss it, right? They just outright ignore it.
And that's like, I guess maybe they feel that that's the best move they can make. But I'm hoping that as this, because I'm still getting people reaching out and saying, hey, I'd like to talk to you about this, who are just hearing about it. And as I did mention, people are still reaching out to me. I think there's going to be additional parts of this story, because every time I report on it, somebody else reaches out and says, I have some more details you might want to share. Not every source turns out to be something that is worth, really, or that I can report, that I can verify. But sometimes they do, in this case of the Gordon B. Hinckley tape. And the other part of the story I want to mention, because it's a 3-part: justice delayed. The first one really focuses on everything we just covered now: Gordon B. Hinckley, that tape, and then Daryl Clegg. But the accusations against Gordon B. Hinckley, they specifically state that he was attending sex parties at an apartment above what was called the Hunter Motor Company car lot. This was owned by Alvin and Walton Hunter. These were two brothers who were also part of the church and who were good friends with Gordon B. Hinckley. They owned a car lot in Salt Lake City in the 50s and 60s. And this is apparently where the sex parties happened, in an apartment above the office of the car lot, and then another house in Salt Lake City, which was owned, or at some point owned, by the Walton brothers. So at first, the tape is called The True Story About Gordon B. Hinckley. He's the president. That's where my focus was. And I think was almost, I'm glad I didn't miss this detail, because the couple of days before we published, I decided to watch the tape again. It's like, all right, I need to watch this tape very meticulously and listen to every detail, make sure I didn't miss anything. And as I was doing that, one of the witnesses to these alleged sex parties, a man named Louis Sims, who actually worked for the Hunters at the car lot, he said, Walton Hunter, I think it was Gordon B. Hinckley who gave him his bishopship in the church. And that immediately kind of, piqued my interest, because I thought, well, if this guy was a bishop in the church, then there's got to be some record of him there, and that means there might be more information, somebody I can dig in. It's just like, when you're digging like that, every little piece can be a link to something potentially, that could shift your whole story. So, and in this case, it did. I looked up Walton Hunter and I found his obituary. He died in 1996. So I'm like, okay, he's dead. I can't, seek a comment from him. But in the obituary, they start telling his life story. He was a bishop in Salt Lake City, which is where this all allegedly took place. So that kind of gave me more confirmation. This guy is a real person. He did exist. He was in the church in Salt Lake City. And then they also said he was a bishop in San Diego and he was a great man, this and that, typical obituary. And they mentioned a couple of his children that, were still living. So I started to look up the children. And shortly after that, I found out that his daughter, a woman named Deborah Hunter Marsh, that she wrote a book called Deliver Us from Evil in 2014, detailing how her father, Walton Hunter, a bishop in the Mormon church, had been abusing her since she was a little girl. And I was just like, whoa, oh my God, this is something else here. Now, not only is it the tape and Daryl Clegg saying that Gordan B. Hinckley was involved in this, but the other man who we know had a relationship to Gordan B. Hinckley, now his own daughter was accusing him of raping her and doing these things. So that kind of adds just like a little bit more of, kind of credibility to the story that this could be accurate. If this guy's involved in these sex parties with young boys and other things, and his daughter's saying he abused her, actually two of his daughters were saying that he abused them, as well as one of the grandchildren, that gives more layers to the story. So I read the book in a couple hours, Deliver Us from Evil. I just was pouring through it, looking for details, and really just reading this woman's story again, trying to give her the time of day. And it brought me to tears a couple times, man. I'll be honest. Like, it's not easy reading through these things and hearing people's, like, the way that this stuff really messes up people's lives and the way they struggle. It's real, And a lot of times the attention only goes to the Epsteins and to the Prince Andrews and that kind of story. And people forget about the victims, right? Maybe people don't know who Gordan B. Hinckley is, or they don't care about Mormonism. And so they're just like, whatever. But that's not what it's about for me. It's about Daryl Clegg wanting to make sure that this information gets out after he died. It's about Deborah Hunter Marsh writing a book about her father abusing her. And it's a self-published book. This book has probably not been seen by many people, So I was happy to find it. And that ended up being the second and third part of my investigation, where I start to focus on Walton Hunter and who he is and what his daughter says. And she basically just describes, a childhood of being abused, raped by her father. And then her sister Rebecca eventually was also abused in different ways by her father. And the worst part of it all is, like, the mother knew what was going on. She says there was no way her mother didn't see the blood and the bodily fluids on the bed. The mom walked in one day when dad was forcing Rebecca to do something to him. And instead of helping, she walks out of the room and calls her a slut. And, it's just this disturbing thing that these women had to go through. They're now grown adult women. Deborah Hunter Marsh is not doing that well. She's not in the best health condition. She's living in an assisted living facility. Her sister Rebecca is, living her life. They have their children, and I got to speak to both of them eventually. And so the second and third part of my investigation tell their story. The third part specifically quotes from Deborah and Rebecca, because when I first published the second part, I hadn't got in touch with them. I hadn't heard from them. I wasn't sure if they were still living. And then after we published, they actually reached out and we were able to write an update. And they said that they believed fully everything that Gordan B. Hinckley was accused of. They said they believe it's true, and they believe that there's no way that people in the church didn't know, especially their father's close friends, didn't know that he was abusing them, and that they think that people in the church turned a blind eye to it. And again, they're both, I think, probably still people who consider themselves Mormon or believers in Jesus, but they definitely see that there's some problem going on in the church, and that they definitely stand by their story still. They believe their father, Walton Hunter, they said he abused them throughout their lives, and they have no doubt that he was also involved in these sex parties with Gordan B. Hinckley, which they were accused of in the tape.
Yeah, I was about to ask that if there was evidence of Walton Hunter attending some of those parties with Gordan B. Hinckley, but you said there was
they're both
witnesses, right?
Yeah, both of them are accused of being at the parties.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's horrifying, really, and I'm just putting this out there again for people who want to check this out. Here's the article that Derrick Broze. This is the most recent one, right? Sexual abuse by former Mormon. This is what we just discussed, and again, I mean, like Derrick was saying, this behavior by Walton Hunter, it corroborates with what other people were saying leaders of the church were doing, including Gordan B. Hinckley. But I mean, it's unfortunate that things like this get brushed under the rug, and when they do, it gives more reason to be suspicious about it and to think that it can only be true, and that they're trying to hide these unfortunate truths.
Yeah, and as I was pointing out earlier, this isn't just like oh, okay, well, maybe this happened, Derek, but that was back in the 60s. No, there's reporting going on right now in the present day,
Mm.
in addition to what I'm reporting, but and in the mainstream, the Associated Press reporting on the Mormon Church covering up this abuse, as recent as just a couple of years ago. So if those stories are getting reported, and I'm showing you stories about of an apparent cover up of abuse and accusations of abuse that at least were never allowed to make it to the light of day so that we could get to the bottom of the truth, and find out what really happened. If that is the case, then clearly there's a pattern of trying to cover up and hide these things. And I think that's what's most worrisome, right? Because it isn't just about the Mormon Church. I mean, there's been investigations over the last couple of years, the Southern Baptists being caught
Yeah.
abusing, covering it up, obviously the Catholic Church and the history of that. And I really think, what it comes down to is positions of authority, honestly, because I mean, we could pull up probably a dozen stories right now of teachers abusing kids, police abusing children, religious folks, et cetera. And I think it's just that positions of authority where maybe parents and other, parental figures kind of have a blind trust. They're like, oh, we can trust putting our kids around the pastor, the priest, et cetera. And
Yeah.
they just kind of let it go. They don't think about it, right? And I'm not saying we should be walking around suspicious of everybody and paranoid or anything like that, but definitely parents need to be thinking pretty strongly about who they leave their kids with. And then the other unfortunate aspect is a lot of times this sexual abuse, just in general, not even getting into the claims of like ritualistic abuse with groups of people, cults kind of thing, but just abuse on just child sexual abuse, it typically involves family members and people very close to the kids.
Yeah. Yeah, people should be careful of them, right? At the end of the day, though these are people in positions of authority and they're supposed to be the holiest of people in these religious groups, then they're still people, right? And
Exactly.
they don't know who they are truly, and they should be careful of that, who they leave their kids with. But this is common. I remember you and Ryan discussed this, that we see this in a lot of religious groups as well as political groups, where people refuse to believe that people that they what's it called, admire, could be doing things like that, because then they start questioning their own ideology. But yeah, you see this connection also, right, between religious groups and political groups, where people just immediately want to dismiss any accusations of somebody that they admire doing something like this.
Yeah, I think it does. There is that kind of religious state component. Sometimes the following the political parties is basically a religion for people, and other people, literally have their religious beliefs. But one way or the other, it's I think that kind of on a deeper level, questioning authority, always having that kind of skepticism towards authority, is just a good place to be. That doesn't
Yeah.
mean you can't trust anybody and you can't work together with people or collaborate with other people, but we definitely shouldn't be putting people into a class in our mind where they're untouchable, or the idea that they could do wrong is unfathomable. I don't know. I mean, it's got to be difficult. I'm not a parent yet in my life. I have 6 nieces and nephews, and I definitely love them like they were my own. And the idea of something happening to them just is horrifying and terrifying. So I can only imagine the difficulty that parents face in trying to navigate that. Trusting who you leave your kids with, but overall, when it comes to institutions, I'd say like the Mormon Church, the Catholic Church, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Southern Baptist Church, the Boy Scouts, that have these horrible track records. Again, not to say every member of those organizations is involved in these things. Of course not. That's not what I'm saying. But I would definitely second guess the idea of leaving my kids within those institutions, just totally unsupervised.
Yeah. Yeah, I would too. I mean, but for me personally, I'm not like a religious person, but I mean, for people who are religious, be careful about who you leave your kids with, because at the end of the day, these are still people, and you don't know them fully. Um,
No.
but with in terms of politics, though, I see how people immediately dismiss, like for example, the Hunter Biden story. Like, oh,
Mhm.
there's no way it could be true. Like, it's Russian disinformation. And I see it on the other side also, where people who support Trump dismiss anything that could be true about Trump, something that he could
Yeah.
have done. But yeah, what do you have to say about that and the two party illusion?
Oh man, well, I kind of shared something on my social media maybe a week or two ago, and it was just this thought of like, oh my God, the elections are coming up, pretty soon.
Yeah,
Still a while away, but you know how it is. It starts 2 years early. So we'll be hearing about it as soon as the midterms are over. They'll be talking about the presidential election. And I was just kind of saying that I'm not looking forward to watching some associates and allies and friends that I've made the last couple of years, but this tends to happen. You meet people, your guys on the same page, and then the elections roll around, and then you kind of see who, in my view, who's still falling for that same old thing, right? It's like people
yeah,
who they care about liberty and freedom right now because Joe Biden's in office, but we know there are people who, if it was Trump, they would probably welcome tyranny as long as it was Trump's brand of tyranny or whatever, right? And then vice versa, and it's just that going back and forth, man. It's exhausting. I mean, I only voted one time in my life ever, and I was young and dumb. I was 18 years old. I figured it out pretty quickly after that, and I just don't understand people who are nearing 60, 70, 80 and still playing that game. I get that maybe it feels good or it feels like it serves some purpose, and there's some issues where these parties do stand on polar opposites. But I think by and large, the issues that we know, like the war,
yeah,
overall destruction of civil liberties, the growth of the police state and surveillance state, support, constant, nonstop blind support of Israel, things like that those never change, right? Those things are untouchable. And that to me is like, it seems so obvious, but unfortunately we're probably going to see a lot of people right now who are very much like, oh no, stand against the system. When it comes time to vote, they're going to pick one of those lesser of two evils.
yeah, yeah. Or they hate one side so much
Yeah,
that they're willing to put up with the other side, even though at
yeah.
the end of the day, both sides serve the same people. Both sides are imperialists.
I don't really
Uh,
like him, but he's better than the other guy.
yeah,
Or I hate the other guy so much, I'll choose this guy.
yeah, yeah. Or they become so obsessed with criticizing only one side that they forget
Yeah,
about criticizing the other side. They're like going only after the shit libs, or only after MAGA or the conservatives,
yeah.
and then they forget about criticizing the other side, and then they end up just thinking that they have to vote for the lesser of two evils because of that. But is
So,
it you see it as like a cult within politics as well, similar to how you see it in
oh,
religion?
absolutely. I mean, I definitely do think that, like, the idea for so many anarchist voluntarists, people talk about statism, or and the idea of just what that means. Sometimes it's used definitely in a derogatory way, but at the most basic level, somebody is practicing statism or is a statist if their first thought to solve a problem is always like, oh, well, let's get the government to do it, right? It's
Yeah,
not necessarily thinking of how can we, the people, take care of our problems. It just, so that doesn't mean you're left or right. You could be a right wing statist, left wing statist, middle of the road statist. If your first approach is always like, let's use the government to try to fix things, that's generally referred to as a statist. And now, for those of us who kind of are trying to get away from those systems, we don't seek statist solutions. But I think many people who are in that realm, statism becomes the religion to them, whether it's, the religion of the Democratic Party, the religion of following Trump, the religion of, praising America, or just that almost religious fact that every 4 years, one way or the other, you're going to vote for one of those lesser two evils. And then you could take it even further, with the religious comparison, that it has the sacrament, the Constitution, the Holy Book, essentially. It has a flag that's, you can't let the flag touch the ground, or you got to burn, you got to fold it up a certain way. It has all these
yeah.
sort of religious components to it. So I definitely think it's very similar to religious indoctrination, political indoctrination.
So do you think that the best solution to this, in addition to the things that you put out there, like your freedom cells and decentralization, but in addition to that, people have to find solutions within themselves and become more self-aware so that they don't become so susceptible to this tribalistic mentality? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's part of my motivation for the work that I call the conscious resistance, is like that sort of internal, individual, but also collective, evolution forward, which is just like you said, it's a self-awareness of like, okay, I need to, like, if for the way I see it is this, like, if you're not self-aware enough to work through your own idiosyncrasies, your own traumas, and really take an honest and like objective look, not like a hurt child that needs mommy and daddy figure to take care of them, or the different little things that this system and these people who want to run the system will take advantage of, then you will be taken advantage of. And I think that's, I do try to practice compassion with the people who are indoctrinated by the system, because I think for some people, it's either like they've been so indoctrinated that Trump is the worst thing ever. And so if they don't go vote, like, then, the world's going to burn down, or vice versa, both sides. Like if this side wins, it's going to be communism. This side wins, it's going to be fascism. There's people who are like, they've been just traumatized into playing this game. And then I think, and for some other people, there is like a psychological component going on of like the need to want to belong, to be a part of a team, right? And then to feel like you're doing something, and just all those different things. So, but for me, the solution to that is that self-awareness, right? If you're a person that's able to kind of think critically, I'm not saying you're going to end up at the same conclusions I have necessarily, or that, that we're all going to agree the same, but you can come from that balanced state of not just being somebody who has gone through 12 years of indoctrination and public education that teaches you the only way to change the world is through the ballot box with the government, and the idea that, we need some new system altogether, or different systems that should compete, is just, that's unfathomable. That doesn't exist. We all know that the only way is, you fight within the system, and you run for office, or you vote, or things like that, right? That's the things that have been programmed into us as the options available. So we have to get back, over and get through and kind of overcome a lot of these various levels of indoctrination that have been handed to us. Even if you didn't go to public school, the indoctrination comes through pop culture and media and movies and things that.
Yeah, I was about to mention that too, how the system is set up in all types of factions. To keep us indoctrinated and unaware, like through pop culture, like you mentioned, in our public school system. And I know you've done a lot of work exposing how indoctrinating our public school system is, and how the best way perhaps to remove this indoctrination from people is through homeschooling programs. But what would you say is the best way to go about becoming more self-aware?
Well, I mean, I'm a big fan of things like meditation and prayer for people who prefer prayer. Sometimes I notice, like, if somebody's religious and they hear meditation, they think like, oh, I don't like that, but I like to pray. So, I try to say both. Whatever it is, for me, the goal is like finding a space to just get clarity of mind. Meditation, there's always people who, maybe you feel this way. There's some folks who say, I can't meditate because they've been taught, or the version of things they've heard is that, like, they're supposed to be able to totally clear their mind and just sit here peacefully zenned out, and like that's just going to happen. And that's not realistic for the vast majority of humans, especially those of us who are constantly stimulated via the internet and cell phones and toys and tools like that, right? That's really difficult to go from overstimulating yourself playing on the computer all day and then just like trying to quiet your mind, right? So it's a process. And the other thing is, like, for me, I like to just make sure, like, I'm here in my comfy spot. I'm here in the chair, maybe at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day, that I at least take 5 to 10 minutes, 15 minutes to just have all the devices and things off. Like maybe before bed, I'm kind of decompressing, and just to have that quiet space. And it's not just that my brain is totally empty and I'm sitting here in silence. In fact, I'm like rethinking and sort of replaying the things that have happened from me from like the moment I woke up to that moment I'm, kind of in that meditative state. And then maybe even journaling down some thoughts that come to mind. And as you just do that simple practice, even what I just described there, once a day, a couple times a week, etc. Obviously, the more frequently, the better. But it's just like, it's another way to kind of rewrite your habits and your way of thinking, but also, meditation, for those who prefer the scientific perspective, meditation has been shown through numerous studies to, when it comes to our brain, you essentially can rewrite neurological pathways, by retraining your brain, your state of mind. And so it's not that meditation, you achieve the state of enlightenment and the world around you is perfect and everything always works out in your favor. It's more that the more often you incorporate and practice that state of mind, it becomes easier to handle the constant barrage of chaos that we live in, right? And like taking that on. And so to me, I think things like that are helpful, because that doesn't mean that you need to become like a deep yoga or Buddhist or, praying, or, if that's not your thing, but just even that time to think will, in my experience, allow you to start to look at your habits and your daily life and see, okay, where can I start to improve, right? Like, I don't like the state of the world and where it's going, but right now I feel like I'm totally dependent on that system, right? Why don't I start just taking some quiet time to myself to really map out what are the areas I feel most stuck? Okay, I still have a bank account, I still got, credit card debt, etc. And really start to think about those things. You're thinking from a logical, clear-headed perspective, right?
Yeah.
That is very powerful. I mean, if we're all coming from that state of mind and approaching our lives like that, then we could see that we could change our lives. And I don't think changing our lives on the individual level is going to stop everything that's happening now, but I do know that the more people who are trying to come from this more conscious perspective and looking at all the crap we're dealing with from that balanced mindset, the better off we're going to be, as opposed to all of us trying to bring our egos and our
Yeah.
trauma and everything and thinking we're going to make a better world.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. It's about clearing your mind, right? So that you don't have such a reactionary interaction with people, and then you do things that you regret. Right? You don't want to be
Exactly.
operating without thinking, and then you have all these problems, and you don't realize how you got all these problems. On top of all the things that the powers that be are doing to you.
Exactly.
But yeah, I like how you explain this in a way you're trying to meet people where they're at, like whether they're religious or whether they're scientifically minded, explaining to them ways that they can become more self-aware, like through prayer or meditation, or bringing up how there is scientific evidence to back that up. But I mean, yeah, we
Absolutely.
need more of that, and lead by example. Like once people start having clear minds and being more aware, and the things that you described, right? Practicing mindfulness, you lead by example, and then that stuff it spreads.
Absolutely.
But yeah, Derrick, I appreciate you coming on, man. You're doing excellent work. I look forward to having you on again for more stuff that you put out. But this stuff that you're investigating is really important, and I just want to let you know I appreciate you doing that work.
Thank you so much, brother. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me on. And yeah, hope everybody who may have just heard about my work for the first time, you can find me at The Last American Vagabond or theconsciousresistance.com. Thank you, guys.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody. Stay informed.